Okay, good afternoon, guys. It is Tuesday, the 14th of September. Jesus, I had to think about that. And I'm up to video 7 of Past the Shallows. I'm going to try and get it all on video so year 11 have it for the holidays. Anyway, hope you're having a good day. Bye. Miles and Harry stayed out as long as they could. They stayed out past midnight until they were freezing because Jeff and Dad had been drinking for 2 days. But now they were back in their room and Harry was busting for the loo. Just go out the window, Miles whispered. I can't. Why? Harry didn't answer. He got out of bed and started jiggling. He could never go to the toilet outside. But you'll have to go out through the lounge, Miles said. Apart from 2 small bedrooms, the Brown house was only one room, a kitchen lounge with a concrete bathroom tacked on. Harry looked terrified, but he opened the door anyway and ducked out. Miles heard his feet hit the lino in the kitchen and Jeff and Dad hadn't stopped talking. Maybe they wouldn't notice Miles got out of bed just in case. He waited by the door. He didn't hear the toilet flush, but the talking had stopped. It's the littlest retard. It was Jeff's voice. Miles opened the bedroom door a few inches. All he could see was Jeff sitting in the armchair and the back of Harry and Dad must be on the couch. Have a drink, Harry, Jeff said. There was a bottle of Coke on the table. There was never any Coke at home, so Jeff must have brought it over. Go on, have a drink. Harry must have thought Jeff was going to give him a glass of Coke because he said, okay. Jeff picked up the bottle of Beam from beside his chair and started pouring. The glass was half full when he handed it to Harry. I meant Coke, Harry said, and he tried to give the glass back. You'll bloody drink it. But it wasn't Jeff speaking now, it was Dad. And Jeff was laughing, his face all red and shiny and laughing. Drink it, Dad said again. Harry took a sip. He was coughing as he tried to put the glass down on the table. But Jeff stood up and took the glass out of Harry's hand. He grabbed Harry in a headlock, wrapped his thick arm around Harry's neck and pulled tight. And before Miles knew what he was doing, he'd opened the door and run out into the lounge. He looked at Dad, all glazed over and puffy, glassy eyes that gave no hope. Let him go. Leave him alone, Miles said. Ah, the other retard. Jeff turned his body towards Miles and dragged Harry with him. He was enjoying himself, grinning at the attention, and Harry couldn't move. His eyes were bloodshot, tears all down his cheeks. Jeff rammed the glass against Harry's mouth and forced his jaw open. The liquid poured in and Harry gasped and choked. Beam spilled down his chin. Miles had tasted Beam before. It must be burning Harry, his throat and his mouth, burning his eyes, and Jeff was still pouring, making Harry swallow by jerking his head around with his wrist and forearm. Miles took a step and lunged into Jeff, but Jeff didn't budge an inch. He just kicked out and caught Miles's leg. Miles went down and his head cracked the edge of the coffee table. He lay on the worn carpet face down. It stunk of damp. He had heard the sound of his head hitting the table, a dull wooden sound, but he hadn't felt it, not yet. Thick liquid ran into his eye socket and he knew it must be blood. Then his fingers burned and he cried out. Jeff's boot was crushing his hand, the hard sole squashing his fingers into the carpet. Dad, he yelled. Nothing. Miles strained his head around to see Jeff move the empty glass away from Harry's mouth. Harry struggled for breath. He looked sick. He was pale and his face glistened with sweat and sticky liquid. Then he was sick all down his chin and onto Jeff's hand and arm. Ah, fuck. Jesus Christ, you little pig. Jeff pushed Harry away, wiping the vomit off his arm with the back of Harry's saturated t-shirt. Miles realised his hand was free and shot up, but now Dad was up too, up off the couch. He stood unsteady on his feet, looked at something in the distance, then his focus found Miles, and he had the same look in his eye he had the night he busted Joe's arm, when Joe was 13, and Miles was 7. The last night Joe ever spent in the Brown house, and Miles remembered what Dad had said that night, what he had said to Joe. You're just like him, you're just like him. Then he threw Joe hard across the room and Joe hit the kitchen bench and there was a terrible crack, but Joe didn't make a sound. He didn't cry or wince or anything. He just looked back at Dad and said, I'm glad. And Miles remembered that he threw up on the floor when he looked at Joe's bent arm and Dad made Joe clean it up. Miles looked down at the carpet now. There was blood where he'd fallen, drops of blood, and there were drops of blood near his feet. One fell while he was watching and he heard Dad slump back down on the couch. Everything stopped and was quiet, and even Jeff was sitting down now. Miles grabbed Harry and they moved into the bedroom. He didn't have to ask Harry to do anything. He was already changing his t-shirt and had his shoes on. "I've got your jacket," he whispered to Harry, and Harry grabbed some things from under his bed. It was still quiet in the lounge. Miles climbed out the window and helped Harry down. They started to run, not down the drive, but straight into the thick scrub at the back of the house. Then they heard Dad yelling from inside, yelling at them, at everyone, yelling at no one, and Miles could hear the words. They came through the brown walls, through the air, and cracked open the night. "I never wanted you." "Where are we going?" Harry asked. Miles didn't know, just somewhere away. The thick track they were on disappeared when it hit the river, and from there they had to skirt along the bank. They were careful not to get too close to the sides. It was dark, really dark. No moon or stars, and it was hard to see the water, but it was there, rushing in the dark, catching on the edge, debris and crack wattle. "We could go to George's," Harry said. Miles stopped walking. "What?" "It's all right. George is all right. He knew Grandad and—" "What are you talking about? How the hell do you know him?" "I've been going over there to play with Jake." Miles grabbed Harry with both arms now. "Who the hell is Jake, and what are you talking about?" "George lets me play with his puppy, Jake, and we have lunch. He told me all about Mum." Miles started walking again as fast as he could away from Harry, but Harry kept talking. "He was friends with Grandad, and it isn't true what people say about him, and we're not going there, okay? I don't know him." They walked in silence for a while, Harry still behind Miles, until they got to the bridge. "George is on the other side," Harry said. "I already told you, we're not going there." "Well, where are we going?" Miles stopped, his eyes burned. He hadn't told Harry that Joe had gone. "I don't know," he mumbled, and he didn't know. Harry stood beside him and put his hand on his shoulder. He kept saying, "We'll be all right, we'll be all right," and Miles didn't know how long they stood like that, but the cold had got in and he could feel it. He could feel something. Now his head hurt, it ached and it stung, and his right eye felt wrong. It wouldn't open properly. "Okay," was all he said. Harry led them across the road and onto the track, almost running. They were close when a dog started barking from inside. Miles stopped dead, but Harry kept moving towards a small wooden shack. "It's just Jake," he said without bothering to keep his voice down, and a light came on from inside. A figure stood in the half-open doorway. "It's me and Miles," Harry said. A dog bolted out the door and ran to Harry. It jumped around his feet, and the man in the door waved them in. Harry went inside, but Miles followed slowly. He stepped carefully onto the creaking veranda, and he tried not to stare at the dark hollows and missing pieces of the man's face. Miles had never really seen George Fuller up close, had never seen his face, but somehow it didn't shock him now. Somehow the man standing there just looked like an old man. He was just an old man. Miles turned away and stepped through the door. Inside, a small gas lamp lit the room. The place was neat and ordered, clean, the walls painted white against the dark wood ceiling and supporting beams. There was a small bed against one wall, and a table and an armchair and 2 wooden chairs. A single shelf with a few pots and things, and a wooden heater in the middle of the room. A rug, a metal trough with one tap attached to the wall. More things than Miles would have thought could fit in a place like this, and yet it all did. George gestured for Miles to take the armchair, but he put his backpack on the table and sat on one of the small wooden chairs instead. Harry seemed happy to just stand there and not introduce Miles, so Miles didn't say anything either. He watched George fill an old kettle at the trough, the water from the tap running slowly. Then he put the kettle on the wood heater. Harry fed the fire some more wood and sat on the floor with the dog in front of the fire like nothing had happened. Like tonight hadn't happened, and he always lived in this tiny wooden shack with this old man. Miles looked at the backpack and then at the floor. His head really hurt now, and the heat of the room was making his eyes swell up. He could feel it growing, his eyelid fat and heavy. He cleared his throat. Harry turned around. "This is Miles," he said. The dog looked up at Miles for a second and then put his head back down on Harry's lap. Miles thought he should say something, but he couldn't think of anything. George stood up and got a box down from the shelf. He put it on the table and pulled out a bottle of Dettol and a cloth. "Okay," he said. The sound came from deep in his throat and nose rather than out of his mouth. He pointed at the cut on Miles' forehead. Miles nodded. George diluted some Dettol with water and soaked the corner of a cloth in the liquid. He moved towards Miles, touching his forehead lightly. He brushed the hair away from the wound and dabbed gently on the cut. The antiseptic stung the broken skin, and Miles pulled away. There was blood on the cloth, bright and fresh. Miles breathed in. "You okay?" Harry asked, and Miles nodded. George fished around in the box and found a butterfly clip. He squeezed the skin tight and applied the bandage, then put blobs of some kind of cream around Miles's eye and cheek. It was cold and it smelled like Auntie Jean's herbal tea, but it made his head feel better. The kettle boiled. George poured some tea into a teapot, followed by hot water. There were 2 teacups and 1 mug. George went outside to the veranda and came back with a bottle of milk. He poured it in all 3 cups and put the bottle on the table. Miles stood up, having a purpose, and took the bottle in his hand. George nodded. It was really warm inside now, and he wouldn't take long for the milk to go bad. He could see quite well on the veranda because of the light coming through the window, but the moon was still behind the clouds. There was a meat safe hanging from the roof, and below it a wooden cupboard with fly wire sides. Miles put the milk in the otherwise empty cupboard and went back inside. A cup of tea was waiting for him on the table. Harry had the other cup in his hands. George put the sugar in already. I told him you have it like me. Miles looked at George as he sat down on the chair. Thanks, he said. Harry gulped his tea down like it was a cold drink. Joe always added some tap water to Harry's tea when he wasn't looking because he always gulped it down, no matter how hot it was. He got up off the floor and put his empty cup on the table. These are like Mum's cups, he said. Miles looked at the cup in his hand. It was like the ones Mum liked, like the ones she had. Auntie Jean had taken all the cups away after she died. She said Harry and Miles would break them if she left them at the house. Now they were displayed in a glass cabinet at Auntie Jean's, and they were never used for tea. They were never used for anything. If you need to go to the loo, it's outside. I'll show you where it is if you want, Harry said. Miles watched George go over to a cupboard and get out a pillow, a sleeping bag and a rolled up sleeping mat. Harry helped him unroll the mat on the floor and unzip the sleeping bag so that it opened out to double size like a doona. They seemed to have an understanding, George and Harry, one that didn't need words. We have to share, Harry said. Miles didn't care. The sleeping bag in front of the fire looked good. It was warm and the light was low, and now he just felt heavy and tired. He just wanted to close his eyes. George sat down in the armchair. Miles lay on the floor next to Harry under the sleeping bag, and the dog burrowed in between them. He patted and cuddled the dog. It felt its small heart beat into his hand and wondered how it was that George came to live here, in a wooden shack with no power and not much of anything. Harry's breathing changed. Miles guessed he was asleep already. The gas lamp went off and soft, warm light filled the room. Miles heard a match strike. He watched the flame, watched George light his pipe, and the smell washed over him. He closed his eyes and he knew that smell. It was the smell of Grandad's house, the smell of the rich, sweet pipe tobacco. And Miles could see Grandad sitting by the fire listening to the radio, his eyes almost closed, slowly puffing on his pipe, and he was there too, just a small boy playing on the floor with his matchbox cars. Grandad had made him a toolbox, and he'd watched Grandad make it. He'd tried to help. He'd handed Grandad things when he needed them. A plane, a chisel, 4 screws that held the whole box together, and Grandad had carved his name carefully on the side, M. Curran, in curly writing. Grandad said Miles would be old enough to have some tools of his own soon, old enough when he was 5, and he held on tightly to the handle of his toolbox when Mum came to pick him up. He cradled it in his lap and waved goodbye as they reversed down the drive. It was getting dark when they had got to the road. The radio crackled with some kind of old kind of song, and a man was singing low and soft like sleep. With the sound of the car and the sound of the radio, and with Mum's voice softly singing along, Miles had to close his eyes. He had to rest his head down against the window, but the car stopped. Miles lifted his head, blinked his eyes. They weren't at home. They were still on the road near the bend where the track was narrow and dark. Mum opened the door. She got out of the car and left the door open, and the cold air rushed in, and Miles called out, but she was already into the trees, and she didn't hear, or at least she didn't stop. She just walked into the darkness and was barely there to see at all except the white frill at the bottom of her skirt that flashed as she moved. Miles opened the passenger door. He got out of the car and he stood on the road. "Mum," he said, and he looked into the trees. Now he couldn't see her at all. He stepped into the earth covered with leaves and cracking sticks, and he touched the rough trees with his hands. The wind rustled high above, invisible, and made the air rain leaves. They fell on his face, and he kept on walking. He kept on going deeper into the forest until he saw her, almost see-through in the dark. Just an outline now, Mum leaning against a tree, her arms hugging her sides, and she was crying. Miles stood silent until he could barely see her anymore, and then he asked her quietly if they could go home, and her voice was small, but he heard her a whisper. I left here once, but I came back. Miles moved closer and he felt for her hand. My darling, she said, and he led her back through the trees and back to the car, and her skin was like ice. Miles rolled over and opened his eyes. Harry was there next to him on the floor, fast asleep. He sat up. George wasn't in the room. His bed was made neat and tidy, and maybe he'd never slept in it at all. Miles had seen him there, his dark silhouette, still in the armchair, but then he'd closed his eyes. He'd slept like stone, and he didn't know how the night had passed or how long he'd slept. He just remembered feeling the warmth of the dog on his back, and then there was nothing. It must have been because of his head. He touched the cut with his fingers, traced over the butterfly clip. The lump around it was hard as bone, but his eyelid opened properly. His eye was working. He could see that the light coming in the window was mid-morning light, and they slept late. He slid from under the sleepy bag and stood up. The air was still warm in the little room, warm from the wood heater, but through the window he could see that the sky outside was clear and cold. He put his jumper on and opened the door. George wasn't outside, neither was the dog, anywhere but he could see. The outhouse was down the back of the paddock, and he walked there in bare feet. The earth was cold and damp like always, but at least it wasn't muddy. He knocked on the door of the toilet just in case George was in there, but he wasn't. When Miles got back, Harry was sitting at the table eating a slice of bread and butter. Your eye looks bad, he said, and he pushed a plate of bread over towards Miles. Miles sat down. It looked good, the bread thick and dark and homemade, but he didn't touch it. It's not our food, he said. Harry just stared at him and kept eating. Miles looked at all the things on the table, bread, a jar of honey, butter on a small plate. Did you get the butter out of the cool box? Harry shook his head. He got up from the table and walked outside. He came back in with the milk, but it wasn't the bottle from last night. It was a full bottle, and he poured himself a glass. Miles tried to think where George would get his milk delivered. He had never seen a cool box on the road near the property, and there was no driveway. He wondered how George managed with the other groceries too. Maybe he got a delivery from Dover. Miles wished that Dad would do that so they would know when food was coming and how long they had to make things last. Harry finished his milk, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and Miles gave in. It was the smell of the bread and the smell of the butter. He held a piece in his hands and took a bite. Miles got up and rolled the bedding. He put the mat, pillows and sleeping bag back in the cupboard, and Harry didn't help him. He just watched there where he was sitting at the table. We'd better get going, said Miles, but Harry stayed where he was. He played with the butter knife, and then he put it down on his plate. Miles walked over and swept the crumbs off the table with his hand. We can't stay here, Harry, he said. But Harry didn't look up at Miles. George wouldn't mind. He'll be back soon. Miles shook his head. He walked over to his shoes and put them on. I'm going now, he said, and he paused at the door and looked back into the room. Harry was still sitting at the table with his head down. Joe's gone, isn't he? Harry said quietly. Miles heard him, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. Harry put the milk back in the cool box and shut the door and ran. Miles was already all the way across the front paddock, and Harry didn't catch him until they were up near the road. When they stopped, he tried to ask where they were going, but Miles held up his hand to keep him quiet. Harry shut his mouth. He watched Miles looking up and down the road and listening. Harry couldn't hear any cars or trucks. He could only hear his heart beating in his head. He took a few breaths. Where are we going? He said. But Miles didn't answer. He just walked out onto the middle of the road, then headed into the scrub on the other side. Harry followed, but there was no path, and branches flicked in his face, and his feet slipped on all the sticks and leaves and wet earth. Miles was way ahead, blending in with the grey of the trees and the grey of the sky, and soon he would be gone completely. So Harry stopped walking. He stopped and stood and still, and he waited. He counted in his head, and he heard Miles crashing back through the bush, cracking sticks with his hand and with his feet. And he thought Miles would be angry, but he wasn't. He was pale, and he was talking. I'm taking you to Stewart's, he said. Harry looked at him. This wasn't the way to Stewart's. This was the worst way they could have gone, because they had to go bush bash and cross fences and go across private land. But he didn't say that. He didn't say anything. It was because of Dad. Miles was scared. Harry walked faster now. He stayed close to Miles and kept up. Joe had really gone. He hadn't even said goodbye. Stuart's mum was in her dressing gown. She stared at the lump above Miles's eye, and Miles said that he'd hit his head on the boat. Stuart pushed past his mum and stood in the doorway. He smiled at Harry, and there was warm air coming from inside the caravan. Harry could feel it on his face. He was glad he was here now, and he wanted to go inside, but he knew Miles wouldn't stay. "I'll bring you some clothes later," Miles said, and it nearly made Harry cry now, the way Miles' eyelid was all purple and cut, the bruise on the side of his face coming up bad. He put his hand in his pocket and felt for the sock that held his leftover money. He'd pulled it out. "You should take this," he said. "You might need it." Miles shook his head. "You keep it," he said, and he tried to smile. Harry watched Miles walk away. He watched him cross the paddock and walk to the scrub, and he kept on watching, even after he had disappeared. And maybe him and Stuart were playing down the back of the property, or helping Stuart's mum pick berries for the stall. Or maybe they were inside eating lunch, and Miles never even knocked or made a sound, because Harry didn't see him come back. There was just the backpack with some clothes left by the door of the caravan, and inside near the top were some chocolates and a bright orange dart gun from his Birdie Beetle show bag. Miles walked away slowly now. The earth was heavy with mud, and in the pockets of the old clearing, well away from the road, you could see where people had lived, old foundations hiding in the knee-high weeds, places where houses once stood. A house, a farm, a family, a home, hemmed in by the forest and the mountains, and a big cold sky, and none of it was any good. This place, Dad's ute, was gone. Miles stood in the lounge, and it was silent. The house, it was dark. He opened up the curtains, and the light caught all the particles of dust. Full ashtrays, empty bottles, and down on the floor the blood was still there on the carpet. He used cold, soapy water and scrubbed hard. He'd probably be able to get it out. A slice of sunlight hit his face. He put his hand out to block the light, but it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming off the metal photo frame on the sideboard. A ray of light, the photo of Mum. Miles walked over and picked it up. She was wearing a summer dress with her long hair down. It was sunny, and he'd never noticed before, but behind her on the photo were the dunes. A familiar shape, and the sand was fine and white. It was cloudy. That day at Cloudy, Uncle Nick rode a longboard, the old kind, fat and slow, but he could make it move, like running free on the water, working the small waves all the way from the point to the sand. Uncle Nick, fluid and silent in all that bright light. "You ready?" he said, and Miles knew he wanted to feel it, what it was like. So he lay on the front of the big board. He held on while the white water splashed up in his face, freezing, and he could see nothing but Nick's arms reaching out to scoop through the water again and again. He felt the board move up and over until they were out deep, until they were out on the clear. Nick helped him sit upright and tall on the nose of the board, and with his legs hanging over the sides, he was brave. He looked down into the water all the way to the bottom. Ripples in the soft sand, balls of loose seaweed flying free and weightless. The black rock and reefs hiding thin beneath the sand. "Safe here," he said, Uncle Nick. And when Miles looked up, there was a line of water, long and straight and rolling, and it was coming. Everything was silent then. There was only feeling, rolling and silent. The pulse, it lifted them up gently and slow, and lifted them high so they could see. And then it let them loose, left them behind, and time came back. Miles turned his face towards the beach, followed the line with his eyes. He watched it rise up, watching it crack and peel, perfect to the shore, and he saw Mum standing there on the sand, all golden in the sun, and he waved to her, and she waved back. Miles put the photo down, and he turned the TV on to break the silence. He'd better get started and clean the house. He cleaned everything. And that's where we'll stop today. Thank you.